The gradual tendency to try to solve problems by means of words becomes heavier and heavier in our daily living. And as a result of arbitrary definitions, we are trying to clarify a great deal of basic thinking which cannot yet be adequately defined. We have words that we use all the time. One of these words is mind. Yet we do not actually know the nature of mind. We try to judge it or estimate its essential construction by its functions. And as mentation moves into actuality in our daily living, we recognize that there must be some process or principle by which thought is possible. And to follow the rather simple, basic thinking of early mathematicians, an effect must have a cause. The cause must be adequate. The cause must usually not only be equal to the effect, but must have a superiority over the effects which it produces. The universal diffusion of mental energy, the innumerable things that the mind can accomplish, these seem to bear witness to a very important, almost universal power at the root of thinking. We may also say that this is applicable as a thought to the problem of will. We recognize a volition in ourselves. We realize that man can accomplish most things that he wills to accomplish if he is able to maintain the continuity of volitional energy. This energy has also no adequate definition in itself. We do not know what this energy is. We do not actually know the processes by which this kind of energy has been differentiated from other kinds of energy. Or perhaps we may wonder if the volitional principle is not at the root of energy, and that just as the will enables man to consciously direct his affairs, another kind of will, perhaps without conscious direction, certainly not from conscious direction on the parts of the organisms involved, this kind of will causes plants to grow and flowers to blossom. Will seems to be a diffused principle which can be grasped and utilized by certain organisms, even as water can be used in many ways to protect and advance the life of man. We've had learned writings on the subject of will, but most of these writings begin with some kind of an hypothesis. We are given a definition of will according to the conviction or belief of some learned person. If we accept that definition, we may then proceed through the text of the learned book. If, however, we reject the definition, then the book no longer interests us, or at least we approach it with great skepticism. Yet this basic hypothesis, which must be accepted, cannot be fully demonstrated to universal satisfaction. If demonstration were possible, there could be no doubts or uncertainties in these areas of learning. Imagination is another parallel type of word. We all know what imagination is. We have innumerable definitions by which we distinguish this type of mental phenomena. Yet we have no essential certainty as to the nature of the imaginative power. We are forced to acknowledge it merely because we are confronted by irrefutable evidence that it exists. If man had no imagination of his own, he would not conceive this peculiar power to exist. And I'm reminded of an architect whom I knew when we were standing side by side at the foot of the Great Pyramid of Giza. He looked at this extraordinary, incredible monument and said very simply, had it been destroyed at some remote time, no human being would be willing to believe that it had ever existed. Thus, if it were not for certain present procedures, many of our most commonly accepted beliefs and ideas would be empirically denied. We would not be willing to assume that they ever existed. Yet we have these faculties. And more than that, we must live with them. We must work with them every day. They are an allotment. And while they offer us innumerable opportunities, they burden us also with many responsibilities. The very power of the human mind has not only advanced man to his present state, but has also continuously threatened his advancement, and will perhaps someday be responsible for the undermining of most of the values which we now regard as indispensable. So we do work with these mysteries, these instruments, just as we work with every other element of nature. We do not understand growth, yet we grow things. We do not understand nature, but we are constantly exploiting it. We do not understand the earth upon which we live, but we live here with a good hope and do everything that we can to adjust ourselves to the existing probabilities. Thus we have used words. We have named things according to our natures, but not according to their natures. This has been a basic trouble since first we began to seriously think about almost anything. And to think itself is the peculiar faculty of man, so that he may rightly be called the thinker. And his very general name, man, is derived from a word which means to think. Thus it may be interesting and valuable for us to try to understand a little more about these processes which we use and abuse, in the hope that we may use more wisely and abuse less frequently. Out of a kind of obedience or lawfulness, out of the proper use of things must arise much of our security. And from the abuse of these natural processes around us and within us, from this abuse comes most of our insecurity. Now it is hard for any person to use wisely what he does not understand. Yet this has been the burden of man since the dawn of things. Man already was far advanced in usages before he even contemplated the natures of the things he used. He had developed his culture considerably before he began to estimate the very substance or nature of culture. He was well on his way toward the formalizing of his religious concepts before he was aware of the principle of religion, or how it could apply directly to himself. Most of his acceptances have therefore been instinctive or intuitional, and most of his institutions have been built upon his own beliefs about things, or his ideas of what they should be. And as these beliefs and ideas became traditionally supported, they became to him facts, so that they were no longer questioned. We may therefore define a fact as a general belief which is no longer questioned. We know that scientifically speaking, certain exactitudes have been introduced. But in the areas of basic values, these exactitudes are still uncertain, few and dim. This morning, therefore, we want to try to see or to advance some more adequate comprehension of the relationship of the various faculties that we generally acknowledge and which we rather flippantly use to the principles upon which they are based. And this brings us to the consideration of consciousness itself. The term consciousness is still largely a matter of disputation. Some groups, both ancient and more recent, simply do not use the word. And according to exact thinking, it is becoming less and less fashionable. One of the reasons why the word consciousness is peculiarly difficult is because it applies to a totality of value which we have been unable to adequately experience or discover. Consciousness is apparently a word which inhibits, limits, or restricts the natural inquiry of man. If we can find an ultimate word and use this as a hook upon which to suspend a body of learning, we are not inclined to do more than this. We are inclined to assume that this is all we can do. And there is a certain fatality or fatalism in our thinking. We already recognize that beyond certain areas we cannot proceed. And instead of these limitations being challenges, they have become discouragements. This is especially true in the term consciousness. It stands for some kind of a totality, a wholeness. It represents some universal substance, some essence, which apparently is an ultimate, so far as our comprehension is concerned. We can express things in terms of consciousness, but we are not aware of how we are conscious, why we are conscious, and what part of our complicated psychological process may be properly termed conscious. We are not sure whether this is an existing and subsisting principle in nature, or whether it is something that is acquired, a byproduct, arising from experience itself. We are not sure whether the word consciousness is merely a name for digested experience, or the effect of experience upon the mind and emotions of living beings. No matter what we do, our very faculties cause us to give certain overtones to our productions. Whenever we perform an action or think or thought, we are inclined to go beyond the very simple and immediate process. We begin to think in terms of what our own thought implies, how it naturally relates to some other thought. And we begin to build bridges in many directions, from an idea toward the universalization of that idea. These bridges provide us with groups of overtone concepts, convictions, beliefs, and opinions. Some hold that these overtones are the thing which we call consciousness, and that consciousness as a complete or separate thing can have no existence. This, however, is only man's attitude towards the problem. Actually, consciousness to us is an archetypal term. It represents something which we feel must exist. True, we can consider it an hypothesis, but it is a universally distributed hypothesis. And nearly every cultural group, sometime in its unfoldment, becomes aware of the consciousness principle, tries to define it, works with it, becomes confused about it, and from this confusion divides the unity of its cultural effort, so that consciousness becomes, in practice, a cause of infinite segregation, separation of ideas, and does not lead immediately to a total acceptance of anything. It has been convenient and popular to assume, perhaps, that mind, imagination, memory, and even will emerge from consciousness. Perhaps we are surrounded constantly with evidences of consciousness, which we have not been able to recognize, or have not been able to organize in our own consciousness or conscious faculty. Thus it is natural for man, when he begins to think of so large a concept, to extend his simple awareness into a field of speculation, always seeking to find more evidence to support his concept of consciousness, and always including this new evidence, so that the theory of consciousness grows, and consciousness itself seems to be a constantly increasing thing. These imponderables have led to many schools of thought, many systems for attempting to apply concepts or hypotheses to conduct, always assuming that if we have a larger knowledge of principles, we shall be able to give a more ready obedience to the laws governing these principles, and in this way advance our own well-being. Consciousness, again, offers the same basic dilemma that we have already mentioned in the cases of mind and will and imagination. Consciousness seems to require a root of its own. It seems in turn to bear witness to something superior to itself. We have never yet been able to accustom our thinking to a spontaneous generation of things. We cannot assume or conceive of orderly values arising from nothing. We cannot think of a universe created from nothing. We cannot fully appreciate the imponderable of a first cause, because our immediate reaction is, what preceded it? How did a cause itself? How did a thing first have an existence apart from that which is prior to first? And, of course, in common sense thinking, what can be prior to first? The answer seems to be that nothing can be prior to first. This has led most thinkers, most systems of learning, into a process of regressive evasions. We do not dare to assume an absolute first. And we allow our thinking always to escape from the things first perceived to things unperceived which must have preceded them. Thus we may say, well, consciousness is first. But then we begin to estimate this problem, and we begin to wonder. So perhaps we say, yes, consciousness as we know it is peculiar to the universe of which we are a part. Perhaps consciousness is the essential nature of the sovereign principle that governs all things. But this principle, in turn, belongs to a comparatively insignificant area of cosmic activity. So far as we can learn, and to our humiliation, our solar system is one of the least important in space. Also, we know that around us and beyond us, there exists an infinite galaxy of worlds. Perhaps, therefore, our solar consciousness arises from our cosmic consciousness. Perhaps this in turn arises from the consciousness of a galaxy. This in turn rooted in the consciousness of that compound which makes up all galaxies. And so we go merrily on our way, pushing back the boundaries of first cause, and also gradually entering into an atmosphere so rarefied that we have no practical thinking at all. This type of situation must cause us to limit terms. If we do not limit our thinking to that which is conceivable, we rapidly fall into that which is inconceivable. And this last term is not a larger one. It is merely the substitution of the concept of chaos for that of cosmos. Now, this does not mean that we must deny what lies far out and way beyond. It means that to allow our minds to drift into this direction too far results in intriguing but non-utilitarian so-called discoveries, which are really speculations. Not to deny, therefore, that this problem goes on beyond the stars. It is more important for us to, in some way, circumscribe our activity in order that we may discover value that can be used now, that can advance us every day, and perhaps challenge us with immediate tasks to be performed, rather than to go too far into this mystery of utter abstraction. This was the concept, certainly, of Buddha, and it was likewise the opinion firmly held by Socrates, that the proper study for mankind is man, that until we solve him, we have much yet to be accomplished. In our solution of him, however, we do not need to lock all our thinking within the frailty of his corporeal estate. We may leave open this door to infinites, but perhaps we should peer through cautiously, lest we become so involved in things beyond us that we lose all interest in the things that can be done. We do not require more than a series of simple acceptances to advance our generalities. The rest awaits those ages yet to come, when man's own faculties may have a better grasp of things now beyond his comprehension. So for our purposes, we cannot deal with ultimates. They are beyond the possibility of being handled reasonably, sanely, and purposefully by mankind. So while it is almost certain that all our energies, all our powers, all our abilities actually have their ultimate origin in ultimates, we must some way assail them on the level of our own abilities. And if we can solve the problems here, we will not need to speculate too blindly. This has led to the rise of a kind of thinking which we might term utilitarianism, not in the traditional form of this word. We are not thinking of things merely in the terms of their commercial or trading value. We are thinking of them in terms of their usefulness in general. And in the terms of usefulness, a thing must be usable. It must be something we can use. And we are not yet certain that ultimates can be used, certainly on the level of the mind. We are using the powers continuously, but we cannot use the hypotheses successfully. Fortunately, we have one ever-present guide to serve us in our difficulty. We live in a completely orderly kind of creation. Everything that exists of itself in nature is stamped with its own purposes, with its own immediate significance. Also, things move from within themselves, pressed on by insistencies which have a certain definable structure. We are able to, therefore, answer the questions. What do these things mean to us? How can we use them? And how can they aid us to advance our common destiny? As a certain practical rule is incorporated in the various processes themselves, it is wise to become more aware of this or these rules in order that we may use them and benefit from the available information. As we all think, the laws governing mind are of immediate value. The mind has as its primary purpose the development of faculties of discrimination, leading ultimately to recognitions of unity. It is therefore the function of the mind to explore the phenomena of life. And as this exploration continues, the fact that the mind itself is ultimately one instrument leads it inevitably to consider all things in terms of one mental energy. Thus, while in its earlier stages the mind is an instrument of infinite diversities, the very mind energy itself must enfold these diversities, must bring them together, and through the faculty of comparison, observe first their differences and finally their similarities. We use the mind principally today as an organ of criticism. We consider ourselves informed if we are able to differ from other people. Now, difference in itself is no virtue. If difference represents an increasing superiority of process, then it may have certain justification. But this process, experience shows us, leads differences back again to identities. Therefore, the mind that truly outgrows an idea remains forever tolerant of that idea. In other words, you may no longer believe something, but you can understand why someone else believes it. You can realize that 5 years ago it was your help. Now it isn't helping. But the processes of mind do not pick up things and throw them away. The processes of mind result in a continual unfolding of things from their own seeds. And having come into the presence of a larger plant, we do not throw away the seed. We realize that each of these seeds will in due course produce the plant. And that wherever we break in upon a stream of natural phenomena, we are breaking in upon a process of growth. That part of growth, which we have, so to say, intellectually understood, becomes the basis of our continual effort to grow further. Thus, growth is a proper mental motion. But growth is never the justification for a basic intolerance. Rejection never means disparagement. Actually, this is true because, as psychology is beginning to understand, we never really do reject things. What we call a rejection is the individual no longer satisfied with a pattern. But this pattern itself is unfolding continuously. That which has gone before is essential to that which must follow. Therefore, as Max Muller, the great Orientalist, said, there never was a false religion unless a child is a false man. There is no reason why, therefore, we should take the adolescent religion and take it out somewhere and shoot it. If we will leave it alone or nurse it more carefully, we will find that it will grow and will outgrow its own smallness and will gradually grow into the estate of the common spiritual values which we all seek. Various patterns are rest houses along a road. People rest in them for a time. And then from one cause or another, the rest becomes no longer restful. And we start out exploring some newer pattern. The man who is born and raised in a small town develops inevitably what might be termed a small town perspective. To him, his own community has very great importance. It is the arbiter of all fashion, style, and value. And for probably the best part of the last 10,000 years, the world has been ruled by persons living in small towns, either literally or intellectually. Sometime, however, some motion, mood, or circumstance will cause the small town man to visit a larger community. Only the visit itself can release him. Others have told him about great cities, but this information has been meaningless because it has not been experienced. Or, as in our day, the great city moves in upon the small town, not only literally, but also in terms of television and other larger circumstance patterns. By degrees, therefore, this man outgrows the small town. But the small town does not die within him, nor does he throw it away, because the small town is the very pattern or essence from which the big town must be built. The small town is always there. When we look back upon the Cro-Magnon man who wandered about with a stone axe fighting cave bears, we give thanks that we are no longer like him. But this caveman was not buried with the ages. He is a solid substratum of our present existence. Without the caveman, we could never have been. He is not dead. He is merely part of the foundation of things. Everything that we outgrow becomes part of a foundation. We are either reaching up to knowledge or stepping up upon it as we would upon flights of stairs. And it would not be very useful to us if someone took away the lower step of the stepladder while we were at the top. It probably would result in another one of those famous do-it-yourself accidents. Thus, growth is a natural process of unfolding from the old to the new. The old remains necessary. It gives us the basis of comparison. It provides us with a means of knowing that we are no longer with the old. For if we could not come into some contrast with it, we would be living in a vacuum in which we could never tell whether we were moving or standing still. Thus all things have their proper places, and it has been observable in mental phenomena that true growth of mind is attended by increasing temperance of mind, that the person who thinks better understands better, and therefore, out of understanding, there is a gradual overcoming of the instinct to conflict. Most persons spend too much of their energy in conflict of some kind, of attitudes or of opinions or of beliefs. Conflict is not the purpose for which mind was created. It is the possibility of mind that all conflicts shall be dissolved, and that out of growth of mental energy and the expansion of its power, man puts the universe together. He then makes the interesting discovery that things which appeared to be unartistic or valueless will gain new meaning when they are arranged properly and grouped according to the principles involved. All nature's patterns are essentially harmonic. It merely remains for us to find the harmony. So our speculation about the nature of mind leads to a very basic conviction which has utility. Namely, that mind is the power which by its unfolding permits us to include more and more of the unknown or the rejected. Instead of assuming, therefore, that mind lifts us head and shoulders above our adversaries, mind simply refuses to accept an adversary and gradually proceeds along its natural course of transmuting all dissonances and forming of them new patterns and compounds of consonance. This is important to us. It gives us a simple yardstick. It tells us that we are wiser because we reject less. We are wiser also, however, because we discriminate better. And out of true discrimination, we rescue ourselves from inadequate beliefs by permitting these beliefs to unfold their own adequacy and to gradually fit into patterns which become comprehensible to us. St. Paul says, milk for babes, meat for men. But if we today in mental optimism should resolve to feed the whole world meat, we would be in trouble. We would still be required, in the spirit of proper understanding, to recognize that all degrees of life exist, and that our real end is to assist these degrees to mature themselves and not to pass arbitrary judgments upon them. So mind, because in some way it is one mind, inclines always to unity of thoughts, unless these are artificially distorted by traditions or beliefs or patterns or processes which destroy the unity of the mind power. It also naturally follows that various minds have different attitudes and aptitudes, but difference is not the base of discord unless the thinking itself is shallow. So in our daily living, we will find considerable comfort in allowing mind to direct us toward a continual seeking for value and a tremendous sympathy for the growth of things, their unfoldments and their developments. And through these attitudes, an increasing unity of our own resources. Some say that this type of thinking must lead to a certain stasis. The individual who is no longer willing to accept conflict, or who has outgrown the instinct toward conflict, is supposed to be a do-nothing. When we say a do-nothing, we simply say that this individual refuses to make previously fashionable mistakes. He refuses to be part of a pattern which has destroyed his world from the beginning. But mind, like all other basic powers, is created or is there in order to lead men to peace and not to war. And the person whose mentality is truly developing may lose some of the rough edge of combativeness, but as a substitute for it, he is able to conserve resources. He is more cautious, makes fewer mistakes, injures fewer persons, and violates fewer natural laws. So the reward is perhaps a suspension of egotism, but not a loss of erudition, an increase of it according to capacity. Now, the same problem applies to the problem of will. How are we going to get the elements of will down where we can do something with them? Perhaps the most common example of will that we know in our daily life is that magnificent little sentence, I want. Now, the moment an individual says, I want something, one of two things happen. Either inertia sets in, and the desire is not great enough to stimulate action, or the individual within his own mind and imagination begins to dramatize that which he wants and becomes disconsolate unless he attains it. If he decides to supply his want, whatever it may be, he then must call upon energy to enable him to achieve a continuity of effort. If his desire to attain something becomes irresistible, but his energy of determination is inadequate, he may well drift into the criminal class, where he believes that he can get what he wants without earning it. But if his will and determination begin to develop, he then finds himself subject to an internal drive. A common example of this drive is ambition. Ambition is an individual attempting to attain a dramatic or exaggerated purpose of some kind. Because we have will within us, we are capable of this ambition drive. And because we have will within us, we are capable of gratifying, at least to a degree, the innumerable wishes and wants which float around on various levels of our thinking. Thus we come to a very practical problem. Is it possible to use the will to curb the will? Can we say, this I want, but I know better. Therefore, I am now going to set about the desperate procedure of overcoming my own desire by the very substance of that desire itself. This is a little reminiscent of the man trying to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Therefore, the will to resist, the will to attain, shows that the energies of will move in more than one direction. We have the ambitious dictator who wills to prominence. We have the hermit and the holy mystic who wills to humility. We have the person whose will causes him to desire to conquer all things, and another equally steadfast in the expression of his determination to renounce the world and to retire entirely into a state of willlessness, to accept only the purposes of the divine in his own life. Will, as we understand it then, is simply this availability of the continuity of effort. It is an energy which can energize various purposes suggested by the mind and the emotions. Well, the mind and the emotions are constantly providing purposes, and the will is constantly energizing them. The result can be, and often is, pandemonium. The will apparently does not possess discriminative power, and by this it is distinguished from the mind. The will is like the electricity in a wire. We can use it to light a house or electrocute a man in prison. We can have short circuits at almost any time. And most of the contrivances that we maintain by these electric circuits are far less interesting and remarkable than the energy that maintains them. So we have this electrical possibility of doing almost anything we insist upon doing. If will becomes exaggerated in our own conduct, we are termed willful. And this is not a symbol of approval. It generally means that we are aggressively determined beyond a pleasant or constructive degree. It means that we are willing to sacrifice value for less than value, sacrifice people for our own purposes, sacrifice principles for our own advancement. Such intensities are not good. Thus it seems that will, like all other motive powers, is really intended to be controlled. The will can be likened to the waters of a river. The waters in the river are controlled by the banks of the river, forming courses by which their channels are directed back to the sea. The endless flow of water through these streams can be likened to the endless availability of will. Any person living by the shores of the river can make use of its waters for his own purposes if he has the wisdom to do so. But the waters are not of themselves purposed in the way that we think of purposes. Thus, will as energy is forever available, but our own use of it must be determined by something. And most of all, our good reveals that it must be determined by a faculty of judgment and a faculty of principles. Thus the mind, informed and enlightened, can make moderate usage of the will to attain those ends which are known to be proper and necessary. But a mind unenlightened will make inordinate use of the will to achieve ends that are not purposeful, meaningful, valuable, or right. Thus, every day we have will allotment. When we get up in the morning and say, today I conquer the world, this is merely a statement that we feel energy, that today we can do things. It's rather unfortunate, however, to wake up with this feeling and have nothing worthwhile to do. This also suggests the probability that what we cannot use, we will abuse. And where our wisdom will not direct our energy, our habits or our ambitions or our appetites most certainly will direct that energy. So now we recognize the concept of power as we know it in our daily life. We are duly concerned today over the danger of the abuse of atomic power. This abuse, however, is merely a vast statement of man's personal abuse of energy. It now lifts this abuse to a great level of potential good or evil, but it is the same basic problem. We must either use to create or use to destroy. In our daily life, in our own quietness, and in the daily concerns of our living, it has been the advice of the wise that the individual should not energize his will processes more than necessary to the accomplishment of his proper purposes. That he must discriminate, that he must not be headstrong, that he must not be determined, nor must he become so addicted to some desire that it is impossible for him to change, alter, or modify that desire. This brings desire into the will pattern. And we now realize that will can be energized either by thought or by emotion. Usually, however, the greatest energization is from emotion. And it is the purpose of thought to apologize for the inordinate use of will by emotion. The mind becomes the great apologist. It is the justifier. It is not that which proves things to be true, but argues its way into the fulfillment of its own premeditated purposes. Will, therefore, in our common thinking, must be directed, and directed by some form of maturity. The willing of the immature will always be immature. The willing of the mature will always be mature. Thus, we have power. But the greatest of all virtues lies in the moderation of that power. In Japan, there is a very wonderful tradition accompanying the Japanese sword. Up to very recently, the sword, of course, was the symbol of gentility in Japan, as it was in Europe during the Middle Ages. A man's sword was the symbol of his honor. He was never to draw it in a dishonorable cause. He was never to fail to draw it, even at the cost of his life, in the defense of those principles which he held to be true. Now, of course, we are not quite so certain that the cult of the sword was the answer to everything. Perhaps it was the best at that time. But you will remember that if the Oriental venerates his blade, we have done the same. For all through the Middle Ages, the hilt of the sword was the cross of Christ. It was bound directly to the concept. And if on a battlefield a man was dying, and there was no priest or other religious available, his companion could draw his sword. The dying man could kiss the cross handle and receive absolution. It was a sacred as well as a profane symbol. Now in Japan, the code of the samurai, or the two sword men, was very simple. It was the same code of chivalry. But one of the greatest of their men said at one time, the true code is this, that it takes great courage to draw the sword in the defense of principle. But it takes greater courage to be true to principle throughout life without drawing the sword. Therefore, the true samurai is a man who wears two swords and could instantly draw either, but because of his own character may die before he draws either. Now, this is an interesting thought, but it has to do with the use of the sword as a symbol of will, a symbolism that has existed throughout history. The problem of the individual who, having will, which is his greatest weapon, must also be the knight of chivalry, who may die rather than to draw the sword. And where it is necessary to the achievement of human character, it is important that the power of will shall not be energized for any inferior purpose, but that, as the ancients pointed out, the proper use of will is to energize aspiration, the inner desire, the sacred desire of man to grow closer to the truth and to his God. These are the high purposes of will. These are the knight errantry of the power of will, and each individual can use it somewhat in his daily life. Today, with a bank account, with credit, with influence, with the infinite potential of going in debt as a basis of a satisfactory social status, with opportunity to do much more than our ancestors could possibly even have imagined. It takes great courage to be moderate. But moderation is the price of peace of mind, peace of soul. And the individual who is a victim to his will is a victim to a tyrant, which will ultimately destroy him. Now, imagination also has its undertones and its overtones. It is wonderful to have a beautiful imagination. It is wonderful to have the power to create an entire legendary and lore within ourselves. It is not wrong for us to imagine, but it is often for us a mistake to lose track of where imagination begins and where truth ends. Our tendency today, because we are an undisciplined people, is to assume that imagination is a valid instrument of fact. Anything we believe, we quickly transform into a sober reality. We become unable to discriminate between the thing as it is and the thing as we wish it to be. Also, we have not sufficient patience to examine the structure of our own wishes, to find out whether they are any more than passing moods or comparatively unimportant appetites. So imagination is all right as long as we know that the things we imagine are things imagined. The moment they escape, the moment we begin to mistake our imaginations for our normal mental, emotional processes, we are not only in danger, but we are very close to the threshold of mental sickness. When we can no longer tell the difference between reality and things imagined, we are desperately ill. Our common habit, however, is not to go quite so far. Imagination becomes largely the instrument of either escape or a constant cause of dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction may in itself be an impetus to action, to achieve the thing which is needed. But it may also be merely a cruel dissatisfaction, in which a person totally disoriented has lost track of the realization that things must be earned, and that the happy person is not an accident, but the result of a long process of personal conditioning, whether it is consciously possible to prove this or not. So imagination leading to escape, forcing us to build phantom worlds, or to pursue phantom objectives, or to magnify things. Imagination is so close to mystery, and mystery is so dangerous to us all, that we must say to ourselves, how can we use imagination profitably? Actually, nature gave us this faculty for one purpose, namely to keep us out of a rut. Nature did not wish us ever to be able to settle down and say, this is it. So the moment we think we're very close to the state of this is itness, a sudden thought strikes us. There is something new that becomes attractive. We can project our present state into a more desirable one. We've barely paid for that little snug 2-bedroom house. Even as we begin to see the end of the mortgage, the sudden thought strikes us. How nice it would be to have a 3-bedroom house. So we go back in debt, and with a little moral support from the real estate agent, we probably end up with a 4-room house. If long before this is paid for, we are in debt for the swimming pool and all these other contrivances, and the 4-bedroom house isn't just where it should be from the standpoint of locality, so we start all over again. This dissatisfaction, this visualizing of something better, this imagining a state of happiness and satisfaction which is not possible under the existing conditions, these pressures cause us gradually to change conditions. If these pressures are admirably directed and properly controlled, imagination presses us on toward the fulfillment of practically everything that is good. We can imagine a utopia in which there is no war. We can imagine the end of crime and of poverty. We can imagine the end of all international discords and dissensions, an end of crime. We can imagine an end of sickness, and we can immediately imagine cures for ailments that are not yet available. All these things push us forward and cause us to try to achieve these imagined ends. Everything, therefore, depends upon what feeds imagination, how this faculty operates in any particular personality compound. If the compound is good, the imagination will be good. If the compound is undisciplined and uncontrolled, the imagination will be excessive. The same kind of imagining which may lead us to bring the world to a better state may also load us with debt for the rest of our natural lives. Everything depends upon use. Imagination can give us hope, which strengthens faith, and therefore gives us a great internal satisfaction. Or it can reveal to us possibilities beyond our present means, which can give us constant dissatisfaction. Like everything else in nature, imagination, therefore, is of itself neither good nor bad, but takes on these attributes from those who use or abuse it. The cultivation of imagination is just as important as the weeding of a garden. Over the weekend, many thrifty householder mows his lawn, trims his hedge, takes care of a few patches of green that he has as a sort of not ownership, but proprietorship over at the moment. If he misses 2 payments, someone else will take care of the hedge. But it is his at the moment. But this same process of keeping a neatness about his possessions must also apply to his inner life, where he must keep particularly a neatness about his imagination. He must discipline it, regulate it, work with it, to the end that it will serve him and not enslave him. Imagination gives the color to life. It has given us the most beautiful of our arts, and certain of the monstrosities which now almost terrify us when we go through the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is, I might say, a harrowing experience. But imagination also causes some people who see these productions to pause in their tracks and say, well, they must mean something. Maybe I'm stupid. Then we begin to develop imagination of inferiority. Any way we turn, imagination pulls us away from the obvious toward that which we desire to believe or which we wish to understand. Therefore, in our everyday thinking, imagination must be directed. It can be beautifully directed. It can be enriched by art and literature. It can be strengthened by aesthetic creativity. It can lead us to the most marvelous self-expression, giving beautiful individuality to our works and our thoughts and our moods. But it must be controlled. Without control, we are lost. Now, if we have already considered these three different factors, we now come around again to the coordinator, consciousness. Consciousness is involved in all these processes. But consciousness seems to be that something which stands apart from them. There is something that says, I can control my will. Not only does it say this, but with a little action, and with not a great amount of incredible endeavor, this will can be controlled. Then there is something that also says to us, yes, my thoughts are important, but I have the right to change them. I have the right also to exercise the power of myself over my own mind. Or we may say imagination is a beautiful thing and is a wonderful experience, but I hold the right to discriminate between these various works of discrimination or of imagination. So we get around again, and there seems to be an interrelationship of these things. When we say that we have a right to control our imagination, we almost always mean that we have a right to exercise the power of mind over the power of feeling. Or if we decide that we are going to restrict our willfulness, we mean that we have the power to exercise reason or the strong dictate of the heart over some ambition or purpose that seems to be getting out of hand. Thus it looks at first as though these various divisions act as censors upon each other, that we use one to balance the other, and that we are constantly playing a very delightful game, checking and rechecking, as in chess, and working out elaborate strategies of some nature to protect our own survival. Thus it would appear that there is an I-ness in this somewhere. There is not only the game with its various pieces and pawns, there is also the player. In this case, a kind of master of solitaire, who is constantly playing a game against probabilities on the one hand, and other probabilities on the other hand. This player seems to possess something that the separate parts of the compound do not possess. But perhaps most of all, the power to use the parts for or against each other. There has to be something by means of which the relationships between these various faculties are governed. And these faculties are forced to conform with some kind of an almost unsuspected, grand strategy. The ancients assumed that this grand strategy was within the abode of consciousness. That consciousness, therefore, had the power, forever and always, either to control the game or with a sweep of its hand to cast the men from the board. That this thing called consciousness was more than a coordinating factor. It was an over-factor. It was another unity in which all these other potentials existed. It was the common ground in which mind and feeling and will and imagination had their root. This common ground has to in some way be the supreme and sovereign dictator over that which is produced from itself. These parts can never escape from their own totality. To depart from this totality would be to be left without source, would be to have the taproot cut off, for they all participate in some vaster common over-principle. This has led most people to assume, therefore, that consciousness is the player behind all phases of the game. That this player is not the mind, nor the will, nor the imagination. That reason is one of the instruments of the game, but is not the primary instrument. And that all processes of mental and emotional and even physical excellence merely reveal the possibility of this excellence, and that the possibility lies rooted in a principle or a cause superior to its own parts. Thus a sum of parts partakes of this commonness of principle, and the sum of parts appears to become the instrument of consciousness. Consciousness apparently refuses to reveal its own nature in divided parts. Wherever we find a part of consciousness, we name it something else. We may name it mind or will. But we have never yet been able to examine total consciousness, consciousness per se. We have never known any way of examining that which is the sum of all the parts of energy which we can explore. One of the reasons, of course, is that the total involves so many energies which are not available to man, therefore cannot be experienced by man. Yet at the same time, all phases must have been experienced at some time past, or must be experienced in some time to come, the future. For all forms and integrations of nature are merely aspects in the unfoldment of totality. Consequently, our knowledge of consciousness must gradually unfold. There is no dogma for it. We assume, however, that consciousness in the individual is the sum of his parts, the total possessor and the total possession. Thus we observe that in most normal persons there is a consciousness factor, a sense of obligation to the value of self, a sense of the rightness of preserving the integrity of self, the sense of the desirability of adequate character, the sense of the importance and dignity of integrity of value. This we have. We do not have it clearly enough to always obey it. We do not sense it with sufficient impact to cause it to prevent us from a variety of mistakes. Yet we possess it. And by the cultivation of it, we enlarge our power to understand and know it. Therefore, for practical purposes, consciousness simply means that every individual is suitable by his nature to the correction of his own faults. He is also suitable by his nature to know what these faults are, without outside assistance, if he wishes to make the effort. He also has within himself the intrinsic capacity to know what is next for him and what is good for him. If he possesses this power, the key to his own salvation is in his own keeping. We affirm this to be true, but point out that the estimation of this and the cultivation of these values may be regarded as a lost art. Lost because it is neglected and ignored. Not lost because it is unavailable. Man's available integration is greater than his achieved integration at any and all times. And any individual who makes normal use of his faculties and emotions creates a psychic chemistry in himself by which self-directive is available to him. Every compound contains within itself the logical and reasonable impulse to the next degree of its own improvement. This is true of man as of everything else. This means that it is possible for a person to daily improve by voluntary decision. It is possible to outgrow any weakness or limitation upon character by which our lives may be threatened. It is possible for us through mind, will, and imagination to provide a continually more adequate instrument for the expression of the total nature of ourselves, which is consciousness. This process, going on continually, will prove to us beyond any doubt that nature has incorporated into every structure the secret of its own survival. That nature has not left anything in the created area devoid of the means of its own growth. And that the problem of man is that his faculties being more complicated, it requires greater conscious effort on the part of man, whereas in many kingdoms this effort is still instinctive. But conscious effort also means that properly used, the endeavors of the mind and emotions will result in a far more rapid growth than can be present anywhere in which instinct alone must direct procedure. Thus the bees have wonderful industry, but it is a slow and difficult process for these little creatures to unfold their natures. Man is able to grow faster because he can make growth a process of conscious endeavor. These elements, therefore, add together to show that abstract cosmic speculations can be brought down and can become recognized factors here and now for persons who are thoughtful and determined and sincere in their desire to live better. Sincerity plus a measure of resourceful determination will accomplish wonders in the life of every person. Time's up. Right on the button, please. Now I'd like to call to your attention, first of all, before anyone gets away, that there will be coffee this morning out in front or in the patio. I'd like to say that there is a new lecture on the table in our lecture note series this morning, Psychic Self-Reproach, the process of the transmutation of remorse to realization. Also, the winter issue of our journal, the special issue, which is enlarged as it was last year, to contain a complete essay which I have prepared on science and immortality, is now also available on the table. We also have some other back lectures that are now here for persons who will be interested in reading some of the notes of earlier lectures, most of which are not dated. Also, I'd like to call attention to the fact that this afternoon the library and reading room will be open Sunday afternoon from 12:30, that is this afternoon, as long as visitors wish to remain to see some of the Oriental art that is now being shown. And yesterday we made a change in one of the exhibits. We have placed completely in the library the run of pictures of the life of the Buddhist teacher Nichiren, pictures that were issued by hand-cut woodblock process in Japan some years ago to celebrate the 650th anniversary of the Nirvana of Nichiren. They're very interesting, and they show Oriental art in a somewhat more modern treatment than some of the classical things which we have had before. Now, as you know, I will be in San Francisco this coming week. Therefore, we have a guest speaker on the program for my class evening next Wednesday, and we have a guest speaker for next Sunday morning. Next Sunday morning here, we will have Dr. William Alex with us. You all know him. Many of you are very enthusiastic about the things he has brought us. And his subject next Sunday morning here at 11 o'clock will be C.G. Jung's contribution to the psychology of religion. And as Dr. Jung is one of the few psychologists who has approached religion positively, I think that we all recognize an unusual value in the things that he has done. Also, we will have, as I told you, a guest speaker on Wednesday evening, November 16th, another one of our very good friends who has been most generous and helpful in being with us, Dr. I.J. Dunn. Dr. Dunn, of course, as you also realize, is an outstanding Jungian analyst, and he also is going to give us some religious material, the religious impulse in primitives, the relationship between primitive and modern religion. I think you will find both of these talks highly informative. So we will see you, therefore, 2 weeks from today. And at that time, November 27th, we are going to discuss the hidden causes of human behavior. So we hope that you will all have splendid time with our friends. Take an opportunity to visit the library. Don't forget the coffee. In fact, just don't forget any. That's the simplest way of saying it. Thank you so much.